Okay, so as many of you know, the elements exist in different ways. So in this video, talking about the secrets of the four elements and just basic ones that I've come across and noticed it in everyday, being present, and it's a wonderful thing because you realize like, it just proves how everything is just connected. So with the four elements, we know it starts with fire. We're talking Western philosophy, Western, European, whatever, the four elements. Not really Eastern stuff. But the point is that they're all connected anyways. Everything is connected. Everything is connected. Can't stress that anymore. So I came across this when I do my cold showers, because it's like you're really in it and you're really connected. I highly recommend it, by the way. So if we were to look at the four elements, we usually start with fire. Of course, that's not always the case, that it's going to be, because I don't believe in beginning and endings anymore, although they do represent that in this third dimensional existence that we're in right now, right? In the other realms, there's no such thing, right? Everything is connected. Everything is just, it's always about connections, and always about just everything is connected. You'll get it once you get there. You might not get it today. That's totally fine. But on to the four elements. I love digressing. No, I mean, I really do, because I don't know, it's fun. So with fire is the first element. It's there's a reason why the word element of surprise, when you have a burst of energy, that's fire, and it's really about like new beginnings. It represents the whole sudden explosion. It's a kind of an inspiration. This is where we get inspiration from. This is where you have intuition, where we have like, oh, what's that? Fire. And how it progresses through the signs is naturally, if we were to start with the traditional way of going through the zodiac, we go with Aries, and that's a really strong burst of energy. It experiences very curious. It's like a sort of, what's this? If you really feel it and if you really tap in, you'll see how fire behaves. If you use your imagination and connect it to your body, you'll notice that it's like, okay, fire does behave that way. And it forms. It also consumes. It kind of just attaches itself to anything because it's really connected to it. Right? It's really, I see the word connected because it's not just in literally the word. When I use the words that I use whenever I'm talking, there's a lot of words are very limiting. So I tend to use metaphors and over metaphors, or what I call like super metaphors. It's just like, okay, so you have to bear with me when it comes to explaining things. It's just the way I talk, and I do hope you understand. Great. And if you don't understand, that's okay. So fire is a burst of energy. It's about curiosity. It's about new beginnings. And then it forms, right? When Aries forms and it goes in our own personal Aries, when we experience new beginnings, we tend to kind of just tap in. You go into it and you go, right? You do this and you do this, and eventually you start to realize that it's like, I'm just starting something, but I'm not really finishing it. And that's typical of Aries. They're curious about things. They like to start things, but maybe never finishing anything. But that's because it just wants to initiate. It wants to have the, right? So it wants to do that, but it starts to kind of mold itself. It starts to become a little bit cooler. You look at the analogy of not just analogy, but the literal, the real literal, I guess, whatever it is of we get from Mars. Like Mars has no atmosphere, so it's not warm, so it's actually cold, and it has polar ice caps. And they discovered ice and then like beneath the ground itself, so that explains the coldness of it, because it's a burst of energy and then it kind of dies down, right? With the people that used to live there, in like I think millions of years ago, when Mars was an actual planet, or people, or there were living beings there, Martians. They were just so was pretty much like Earth, I believe. You look up all this stuff about aliens and all that stuff. It's not so alien anymore, right? So, but basically, that was the burst of life, I believe, there, right? And it kind of signifies how it's related to Aries, Mars. Aries, got it. First house, okay? We'll go into that later, but the four elements definitely represent this whole. If you lose the four elements themselves and sort of how to guide you into your life, that they're always all connected. So it starts to mold itself in the first house in Aries into Taurus. It starts to become cool. It starts to solidify. It becomes Earth, right? It starts to want to stick with the things it's discovering, stick with the things it's experiencing, and start to make it sort of its own. And that's where Earth, as matter and form, wants to experience it, it sensualizes things. It's Venus ruled Taurus. It wants to sensualize things. It wants to go, okay, there's that part of us that goes, okay. And by this way, when I say it, I mean anything. Okay? Anyone, anything, anywhere, anyhow. Okay? But get a feel for what I'm trying to say. So, with Taurus in solidifying its experiences, it wants to stick with it. It wants to connect. It wants to feel. It wants to really feel. This is why it's about pleasure. Right? Taurus is about pleasure. It's a Venus-ruled sign. In the second house, it starts to develop some sort of worth in itself. It starts to identify with. I believe Taurus in the third or the second house is when we, in our lives, we start to identify. The first house is ego-ish, kind of. But we start to really identify because it's about worth now in the second house, right? So we start to get really into it, but then we start to realize as we progress, as we kind of go through things, we start to realize that it's like it needs to kind of be a little more. We already understand a lot of the experience that we go through. Then we kind of get a little bit analytical and sort of kind of question and have questions and ideas in our heads, and it becomes a little bit more technical. We start to break things down. When we have Earth and it starts to break things down, think of Earth turning into sand, and sand is turning into little little particles, right? That's in the air. That's how air moves. It moves through very minute little particles of solid, basically. It's a weird thing because you're like, well, gas, how does it go from solid to gas? Isn't that sublimation or something? Or what is it called? There's a freezing, I don't know, whatever. The point is that it does have those little things that you think of that are super tiny in the quantum realm, in the subatomic realm. You have the little particles that go, oh, okay, they're floating. So that's kind of like, it affects how air moves. Makes sense, right? This is where we get these lofty ideas. So we have lofty ideals. We have ideas and, and thoughts. You can call it also inspiration, but it's a little bit more grounded inspiration, because that's why Gemini is practical knowledge. It goes from Taurus in Gemini into what information, what it's learned, and what it's learns and puts it to use, basically. Okay, and then we get ideas that we get to start. It's really about the learning process. It's about transmissions, communication. This is all about we can't see it, so to speak, or we can't really touch it, because if you think about the senses, the five senses, it's more solid based, more material oriented. So when you think of air, it's like we can't touch it, but actually it's there. This is why we think about air. If you try to let's say you can say, what's the word? If you try to force air into some sort of like, if you try to make it compact, eventually you'll find that it starts to build into something. How do you explain dust? Right? So the little things turn into the big thing. It's a microcosm with the macrocosm. So as air becomes a little bit more solidified, sort of re-solidifying, it starts to, because it's already in softer, lighter state, it starts to be about sensing, start to be about a sort of a gathering, a collecting of things, and it starts to become attached to things. This is when you start to attach to things, you have a more, because we're talking about thoughts, right? The thought that becomes emotions. Thoughts become emotions, but we have to have thoughts first. And then we start to kind of identify with, that's the process of the human ego, and it goes into water. It starts to sense things, it starts to feel and starts to understand it. It's like, oh, okay, this is the knowledge I gain, but how does it... So the ego creates thought, and when it repeats itself, eventually it becomes emotions, it becomes belief, right? When it goes into water, it's sort of this is why water that's why if you look at water itself, it's part what? Wait, hydrogen, oxygen. What's hydrogen? What's oxygen? Technically it's air, or parts of air. So, but when you put them together, those molecules, they become water. Right? So it makes sense. It makes so much sense. It makes fucking perfect sense, right? So emotions start to become something familiar, and it's because it basically start to work towards instinct eventually. So it's a cooling effect. It starts to harden sometimes. It's it's moving, it's flowing, connecting. It's the ups and downs when you look at the flow of water. It's much denser than air, but it goes through that. But it starts to realize the thoughts it's developed from the airy qualities starts to become more about, oh, it's identification again. The thing that it carried over from fire, which is ego. But all ego is ego. But it starts to connect with it and becomes attached to it. And then eventually it starts to experience the ups and downs of emotions. This is where Cancer comes in, right? And start to realize it's a moon ruled sign, so therefore it's really about, you know what I mean? So I don't know if you sense it, but if you look at water, if you look at it, water actually is very attached to things, and this is why there's that connection to it. If you look at water, and you look at it, let's say you try to remove, let's say you have a piece of glove, right? And it's dry. Okay, you just remove it, right? Easy peasy. The moment it gets wet, what happens? It's a little harder to get off. Exactly. That's water. That's the nature of water. Nature of water wants to attach. Nature of water also wants to trust. It cannot trust and attach itself to you if it doesn't trust. If it's not connecting, if it's not having an emotional connect. That's what emotions are. Emotions are thoughts or that transmissive sort of like, that's transmitting sort of thing between what air was and starts to become more like this. Okay? There's a connection, there's a flow, but it starts to go, it's like, I don't know if that makes sense. I can't, putting into words doesn't really help. But that's what it is. So when it starts to experience those things, it starts to become more connected, it starts to go deeper into the psyche, it starts to go deeper into more like identification, but it does process it, and eventually comes the actual soup through the more, I guess you can see, the solidification of more of the egoic self, the more identification, which goes into Leo, which is fire. But it's also another burst of energy, but a little bit deeper. It's a little bit more, it's heavier fire. It's great because it is a fixed sign. It goes into that. So it goes, okay, here's fire, and here's so it starts to identify with the self. The fourth house that Cancer rules has a lot to do with the inner self. So it's a little bit more a deeper side of the ego that is more like not just about curiosity anymore. It's more like, now it's really identification, really a me thing, right? Versus with the first three houses of the first quadrant, they're really more about curiosity and just experiencing what is me. But the me in here, this one is more like, oh, now I understand. I have a role to play. I can shine. I can do this. I can, so there's that flow of the fire in there that comes from water because it started to release some of the things, start to trust a little bit more, starts to become more intuitive, and that's where Leo comes in. The Sun world sign is very, very intuitive. Not the most intuitive out of all the signs, however, it is quite intuitive because it is the sun. And if you look at the rule, it's ruled by the sun. The sun is is a star basically. So it on its own doesn't need anything else, but it does generate a lot of energy. But where does it get energy from? The cosmos, the universe. So therefore, it actually gets guidance directly from, I would say, the cosmos, because it is a star. There's a reason why it shines on its own, and you can see it in the sky. You can't really see the other planets, but you can see stars more clearly. Right? This is giving over that energy. Once it's done that, it goes into the cycle again of fire, where it starts to form. It starts to understand that this type of fire starts to understand that it has a lot to give, because it's already gotten so much from its own experience, from itself, from its guidance, from its trusting in its intuition. Even though it has gone through those emotional things, it starts to, when you come from Cancer, you have that sort of collectiveness, right, with your family. And once you've had that sort of like foundation, it's really about the foundation, the building, the concept or the notion of foundational building, or the history or the heritage. It's almost like you have so much with you that you're able to give it. This is why the fifth house is also the house of children, because it's about creativity, it's about being able to give, it's about being able to create, because you have so much to give. This is the house that works with Leo. It's a Leo ruled by Leo and internally ruled by the sun, because it's like, okay. Right? A lot of energy to give, a lot of things to offer. A lot of inspiration as well, because it is fire. Once it starts to process all that stuff, it starts to, in a way you can say, solidify again. It starts to mold, it starts to form, it starts to cool down, and it starts to kind of go back into a bit of that Mercury sort of thing with Gemini, where it's like, it starts to realize, like, how can I break this inspiration now? How can I be generous so that I can bring it here to this planet, to this plane of existence? Service. By working through things, through the experiences had with the knowledge and inspiration, intuition, bring it to Virgo, which is now again back to a matter and form, experiencing, growing, maturing, right? In this case, Virgo is a mutable sign, even though it's Earth. And technically it's already broken down. It's becoming this fire that has kind of, it's like little bits of generosity. I don't know if that makes sense. So it's kind of like this lighter, it's a mutable sign, it's all about adaptability. Mutable signs to me always feel light, because they're so flexible. They also represent transitions, and things can end through the mutable signs, or the mutable experience, so to speak. That's why it's called mutable. It's changeable, it's adaptable, it's malleable. So the malleability from that Virgo has, that came from Leo, of the generosity thing, is expressed through gratitude, maybe gratitude, but servitude. Therefore, it's expressed. It's become this sort of expression. It's manifested through its work, and that's why it works hard. But because of the sun's energy, because of that transition into this Mercury / Chiron ruled sign, it wants to maintain that sense of purity. It wants to maintain. This is why Virgos love perfection. They criticize because they want you to get it right, because they know from past experience that it's like the evolutionary experience from being giving too much, or is you cannot be generous without getting also something in return. Virgos also love to be, they don't really want anything back, they just want to be complimented, and that's okay. They say thank you, that's totally fine, because they're willing to give of their experiences, they're willing to give of themselves, and that's where health is right. Health is definitely concerned. This is why health is part of the sixth house, which is ruled by Virgo. And when we're overworking things, it does affect us on a physical level. That's why it's also tied to the unconscious. When we're not paying attention to the things we do every day, and it just becomes routine, and it's kind of like you kind of lose focus on why you're serving in the first place, why you're offering and helping people, offering things and helping people. You know, the generosity, the purpose behind all of that, the inspiration you got from the previous sign, from Leo, is now kind of like, right? In the third house, this whole curiosity thing about me has this Mercury sort of aspect of like working with information and knowledge is about the conscious level. We know what it is. But even then, with the third house, it's also the house of where we take things for granted, like the skills we take for granted, because we're so like caught up. It's a very Gemini thing. You go, chick, chick, chick. So Virgo acts in a similar way, where it's like this, and there's things that eventually start to be forgotten or taken for granted. So it's kind of similar, even though it is the house of the unconscious, meaning things just becomes routine. So it goes through that, becomes very technical, it goes through that, and then it gains more knowledge again. But in this time, it's not about the knowledge, just knowledge itself, in terms of, it starts to, this earth element starts to realize, it's like, oh, I don't just have to serve, I have to kind of also look at my purpose in it. So it starts to build that whole identity of you and I together. It jumps from the Aries up to Libra, where Virgo brings over that energy of purity, of like it has to be still about generosity, but in this case, you and me, because once it came from Virgo, in this case, in this need to serve, this wanting to serve, wanting to be of service, it starts to realize, it's, oh, wait a second, when I do this, I get back. When I do this, I get back. When I give, there's reciprocation. All right, cause and effect kind of thing. And so Libra understands this now, that it's like, okay, where the purity thing comes in, that carries over from Virgo, where this earth element really realizes that's like, oh, it's that I what do you call this, that I've done things for you, that you've done things for me. There has to now be this harmonious thing. That harmony, that perfection, there's a tie between harmony and perfection. That's why Librans are also kind of perfectionists too, because it carries over that energy. So, but in this case, it's all about you and I. What gives it that feeling of like going from a mutable to a cardinal is now it wants to flow, it wants to take charge when it comes to maintaining harmony, because it's realized, it's like, oh, from the second quadrant of like realizing you and me, now it's like, oh, wait, no, it's no longer me, it's more like you and me. There's a connection now. It's bigger picture, right? It's a bigger picture sort of thing. And this air wants to work with ideas through you and me. It wants to maneuver ideas, want to maneuver logic, and so it's because it's a you and me thing, it ties into that whole balance thing, right? This air wants to balance. It wants to be not just flowing here and there like Gemini does, it's like here and there, but more like here, here. What is your here, 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 with me here, 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 here? I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like more like a unification, right? So it's the ego being extended towards you and I, or I and you. Right? It's a joining of two souls. This is why Libra loves love. And In Gemini, that can be similar too as well, because it's an air sign, but because it's mutable, that signifies its need for just connections. Geminis are known to be flirtatious, meaning because they haven't settled down yet. They haven't gotten to the point where it's like, oh, now it's time to take a relationship seriously. No, they don't know that. Gemini wants to be, it's all about curiosity. It's about, again, it's the first quadrant. Going into this third quadrant, starting with Libra, it's this importance of, I must make it about you and me. It must be a link. We have to take linking seriously now. So now air becomes a little bit denser. Here, air becomes more about, again, that balance. You can't have the scales and put air on it and not have weight. That doesn't make sense. It needs to have weight. For it to balance, it needs to be balanced. Okay? So air, eventually this air, feeling of air, this experience of air that we have when we look at our inner Libra, our inner 7th house, is the weight of balancing emotions between relationships. We start to understand, it's like, oh, emotions come easily now through this kind of air. It's not as purely logical anymore. It's more like it's considering that logic had its purpose in order for there to be harmony and peace. So right away there's a kind of a link directly to the heart as well, which is funny because Venus is also about emotions. Venus rules Libra. But Eris also rules Libra. Well, it's now being more accepted more and more. I think so. But to me, at least personally, Libra, his main ruling planet now has become Eris, because Eris is also about balance and trying to, and it's social interaction, complete social balance. So complete social inclusion, as Pam Gregory puts it, social inclusion. It's about really coming together. The idea of two makes one. But it's also duality. This is the house, the 7th house is the house also of specifically the descendant. It's about the shadow. How we reflect what we see in ourselves reflects back to others, and what we see in others reflects back to us. It's the mirror effect, the phenomenon of projection, right? And we point one finger, three point back at us. So this is what Libras, this is why there's weight to it. This is why it's about the scales. This is why it's a heavier air. But it starts to realize this emotional process that it's like, oh, because it wants to be, it's a very sensitive sign. It's very much about harmony and very you always want to treat Libras with kindness and softness. But once it starts to realize that it's like, oh, this softness cannot work. I feel like a doormat. Shadow comes in and starts to realize there's a resentment that builds in. It starts to become deeper, much deeper. So this air is quite heavy and definitely going towards Scorpio, where this air starts to feel more like these logic and ideas and experiences and information that it's gathered through this connection between you and me is now become this sort of does you and me make sense? Is it really what we want? This is where we get into that watery, heavier, ice cold Scorpio. Not exactly ice cold, it's actually very sensitive. If you look at ice itself, just because the particles has become solidified, there's ways to soften it. Scorpio is water that can flow, but it will harden because it wants to create boundaries. It needs to create boundaries. It's learned from Lee, but it's like you can't be a doormat. You have to open and soften that water into your emotions to others who you trust, who you get along with, who you resonate with. Right? And Libra didn't know that, but then it's like, oh, because of that experience and the knowledge. Air kind of works similarly to how Earth is. Right? It's experience, but it's experiencing more through logic. It's up here. And this is why all the elements are connected. The flow has to continue. because otherwise it doesn't make sense. You can't just be like, I'm this air, and it doesn't make sense. Whole. So and then water, in this regard, start to move between its frozen state and its like liquid state, frozen, liquid, frozen, liquid. So it's like hard, soft, and knowing when to time that. It's becoming highly instinctive, more instinctive than Cancer, I would think so. And deals with not just the ups and downs of emotions and the pain, but also the trauma. This Pluto-ruled sign knows that it has to come to the truth. Libra also has definitely come to the truth when it was, and that's where it brought in that energy, the air that was there to realize that the truth must be acknowledged and must be important in terms of, especially with shadow. And because Eris does that too. Eris represents the flinging effect, or the sort of like that whole like shadow where it's like, are you sure about this? Okay, you asked for it, it's a decision you made. Shadow, there's a direct correlation between what choices we make, karma, and definitely the shadow. Because if we make choices that we make that has consequences that we don't want, the shadow makes us realize, is this why you chose this in the first place? Why did you choose that in the first place? Why did you kill that person? What was it you're angry about? Because you were projecting that anger into someone else instead of embracing it in yourself. The shadow. And so in this case, with Scorpio, there's also the house of endings. Every time you have house of endings, or the water signs, it's a very contemplative process of the element of water to process emotions. Emotions are not just working with information, but it's an instinctive, also intuitive emotion processing. It has no need for words. It's done with the words. It's done with the logic. It's done with the information. Now it's a different type of information, a different type of logic. In fact, it's e-logic, which is fine because it's like underneath its depth. It's a depth of being. And where Pluto comes in, it helps us to, and also forces us to work with our trauma. Where emotions have become too heavy or to become shocking is because the reason why we have trauma in the first place is because we were too comfortable. And this is where Libra was, this Venus sign, this Venus ruled sign is about comfort too. Once you start to realize like, oh, I can't be that comfortable, right? It must work with the emotion. And this is why if you look at any square aspects on the chart, Libra as a sign would typically might square Cancer. So it's deep emotional, understanding, deep emotional processing, the emotions, even though it goes ups and down, process it. This is why you close the doors and you put that, you crab yourself in, if that's really a word, right? And you go, nope, I need to process this, leave me alone. It comes in through isolation. Signs, the water signs are known for isolation as well. And because they had to process the logic or the information or the whatever they got, the experience in the past, and make it sort of, it has to die. They have to surrender to it. Right? So eventually, once Scorpio has surrendered, just like the other water signs, then it can move on to fire itself again. Right? It can trust again. It can be, this time, a lot more intuitive because it's like with when it goes into Sagittarius, the 9th house, it's all about opportunity, right? And it starts to know, it's like, it can go beyond this, it can be expansive, it can be creative, it can be trusting, it can have faith in what's beyond there, because it knows that it's like, it's gone through that death, it's gone through transformation, it's gone through a total, flaying of egoic beliefs and all that stuff. And now it's like, here comes the opportunity. Right, so this fire now works as a very mutable sign. It's the second most adaptable of the mutable sign after Gemini. And because of this jump from like a really stubborn, like fixed air water sign like Scorpio, it comes to this sort of like release, and it just sort of burst out, and it's sort of just like, this is why it's a burst of energy, but it's not exactly like, it's a slower process, because coming from Pluto orbits the sun at a very, 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 very slow rate. It's a generational planet. So this effect on Pluto, on Scorpio, and therefore it's like its element, that it's a fixed water sign, means that it's has to have complete release, right? Complete death, and then, but it's like a slower process. Pluto rules rot and decay and degeneration, regeneration. All right, so it's like mushrooms. But what mushrooms do? They're the flowers of the mycelial network. So they reveal to us a lot. There's the reason why mushrooms have a lot of protein in them too, because of all that stress and energy. So it ties in with optimism, ties in with what it now can give on to the next state. It's still in the third quadrant, which means it's still about you and me. It's still about friendships. Sagittarians, the reason why they love sports is because it interacts with people. It's in a very competitive level, but it's more like optimistic. I raise you, you raise me, we raise each other. Right? It's very third quadrant energy. So, and then it taps onto this Jupiterian energy of growth and expansion, and this fire is the one that wants to not only experience but understand why is this burst of energy in here in the first place. Look, what was generosity from Leo, and what was that independent nature that brought carry over from Aries? What was that about? This fire wants to mix things into some sort of philosophy or belief, but it's like, okay. But of course, once it starts to become a little bit more certain of itself, this fire might start to mold in a way that it starts to form ideas about what belief is about, what faith, and it becomes a sort of like organization. This is why you have churches in the first place. This is also, organized religions, organized faith. You have dogma, all right, indoctrination, doctrines. This comes from the 9th house Jupiter. It will eventually carry it over to the 10th house, and therefore, so the fire becomes a little bit more solidified, and it's solidifying that sort of, because optimism and faith they're very connected to each other. They're very much, but once it starts to become more grounded, it starts to go, let's make this into a reality, into matter, which ties into the Saturn ruled sign Capricorn. Saturn rules matter, therefore Capricorn is definitely coming back into its own, being in touch again with earthly things, but this time refinement, because it's now, and the reason why Capricorns love refinement is because there's this inner energetic sort of belief that it believes that I worked through all this optimism from the previous experience from Sagittarius, and therefore you can say that it has a deserving attitude. It's like I deserve this now, so therefore I worked hard at it, and I'm working hard at it, and this is where the discipline comes in, where it knows how to work hard at things, it knows how to be disciplined. But it also ties in with the 10th house stuff, which is reputation and ego, so therefore status, because it's solidified that whole like belief itself. Belief has become not free-flowing and free-spirited sort of feel, but it's become sort of this, I must put it in a box. Saturn rules limitation, Saturn rules limits, so therefore it kind of behaves a bit like the moon, like traditions with Cancer, and puts things in a box and kind of closes it in and say, okay, well, this must be kept because I'm afraid, see, there's a fear thing. I'm afraid that if I don't do this, I will lose that inspiration I gained from Sagittarius. So that Earth wants to keep that form. And I believe this is the one that is the most attached to form. Well, Taurus can be as well, but Taurus is more about the feeling itself. It wants to simplify things. It wants to and it carries over also a bit of that Virgo energy as well, where it's like it's about service to the public, service to the world, service. So there's a sort of egoic attachment to earthly things, to earthly acknowledgement, to earthly experiences, earthly success, earthly achievements, earthly service, earthly. Very much like it kind of starts to become more like, well, this is Earth, this is what we're here, and this is all that we understand. If you look at Earth, Capricorns, they don't, because it's Earth, they have to tap in even much deeper into the psyche of their own earthiness, meaning that they have to even go lower. If they want to be so attached to Earth, then they have to go lower than that. Because otherwise they're stuck in this plane of like neutrality. Well, I wouldn't say neutrality, but they would be stuck in this sort of like, this is Earth and this is what it is. But Earth has a potential to be intuitive. Earth has a potential to be instinctive as well. All signs have the potential to be like each other. All of them. Same with the elements. Same with anything. Okay, same with anything. Same with anything and everything, and all the things above and up and down, left and right, all of it's connected. So Capricorn understands that it has to work hard, but it's kind of stuck there sometimes. In order for it to do that, it has to go even much deeper into why, much deeper and also much higher into why limits are put in there in the first place. Because of karma. If you make certain choices, you can't go past a choice that you think you made a mistake on because you're labeling it as a mistake. Labeling is a part of an earthy sort of thing, and also air, where it's like I'm putting a label on it, I'm putting it in a box. You put labels when you label something, you put it in a box. Very similar. Earth, air is very similar in that case. So Capricorn has to go through this process of eventually forming what needs to be formed, but is it going to form it out of ego? Or is it going to form it out of this, not just the only outdated stuff, outdated, when I'm referring to outdated, it also means like traditions. That's also a Saturn thing. And the shadow of Capricorn is tied back into the fourth house, which is also tradition. What do you keep? Keeping is tradition. When you're keeping something, when you're preserving something, conserving something, maintaining something, you're protecting something, that is a form of, it's tied to tradition. It's tied to not only the past, tradition, but also things that you're afraid of releasing, right? Because otherwise you won't be able to go into the next, and the next, and the next, and the next. But it is the reason why there's zodiac is a cycle, the reason why there's a circle is because the cycle has to repeat itself in order for us to learn. Okay, so with Capricorn there, again, it has to learn how to release the things that are of the old and into the new, and so that it becomes lighter, so that it becomes like, okay, well, it's lighter, but at the same time heavy. So it keeps on, it continues, it maintains what things that it's formed, that works for the sake of humanity. Because now we're going to the fourth quadrant. Now it's not just about you and me and us, but more like the bigger us, right? Society. Fourth house is about society. The fourth house is about the collective, and so it works toward the ones in the lower quadrants. When they say lower, I mean like the southern quadrant. This is the south, actually. Above that, this is called the south, the southern hemisphere. Yes, it is. This is about society, and the reason why it's also, by the way, that makes sense now. Why it's the southern hemisphere is because I believe that has a lot to do with bringing down the knowledge and the gifts and of divine cosmic, whereas the northern hemisphere, the southern one, works on, there's a reason why it's kind of like the self. It's not just an astronomical thing where it's like, okay, so when it's in is it noon? I totally forgot what it was. I think it's southern. I believe it's the southern one. Anyways, either way, I'm kind of digressing a little. We'll talk about that later. So, the lessons, or the Earth has to go through is this change again. still remaining hard, but still kind of soft and more airy, like sand, turning it into sand, making it into a lighter element, which is air, but in this case, a more denser element, the more denser air. It's funny because if you think about Aquarius, it just ruled this Uranus ruled, plus also Saturn ruled sign. It reflects a lot of the hard and the light, the heavy and the light, the hard and the soft, meaning that because it's Saturn, it's matter, and then Uranus is the earth shaker. It's like a revolutionary planet, sign of revolution, sign of changes. It kind of goes back and forth between the two. Solid, gas, solid, gas, solid, gas. So it's sudden. You can, usually when you have solid, usually you like to transition into liquid, right? Usually it's more preferable. But Earth doesn't do that. Earth doesn't do that. Earth has to go into gaseous state. You can add liquid to it, but it doesn't naturally on its own liquefy, unless you're talking about like creating metal. That's totally fine. But see, that's where it comes in. It's like it's the what do you call that? The experience of Earth through Capricorn is that it can solidify, but in terms of it, if it were to be what do you call molded into metal, we're talking about the symbolism, the esoteric symbolism of, or the alchemy of it. If we were to turn Capricorn as the metal into metal, Earth into metal, we have to go back. So we're technically we're regressing. I believe that when you turn into metal, you're regressing because now you're becoming harder than instead of softer. You become more stubborn instead of adaptable. Right? But again, there's something to that as well. When you become metal, what happens is that it's almost like you're creating a new element. Which is funny because electricity has a link to fire. And electricity is ruled by Uranus, which on its own, which in turn rules Aquarius. So in a way, metal also can be associated with Aquarius, and this makes sense because it's technology, right? It's all connected, right? So with Aquarius, sort of have that symbolic metal to it. It's to learn to alchemize either metal or also air, but in this case, electrifying air, electrifying Earth. So you get what I'm saying? So I hope you get what I'm saying. So, anyways, so Aquarius is now learning to now work with new ideas of how matter and experience should be, how experience should be in the first place. Because Earth is usually about experience, it's about doing things, it's about using hands, being hands-on, being here on Earth, all that stuff, very earthy stuff. But now looks at it in a different way and say, okay. But then because it's for the sake of society, it's for the sake of the collective, it's become so up there and so hard that it actually acquires this kind of air has now become detached from emotions. Which is funny because it's not actually detached. Its shadow comes through in Leo, which is you could say the pride in one's achievements, how it, the 11th house is the house of not only, also the house of non-emotional relationships, non-emotional friendships and communities and all that stuff, but it also is the house of where we earn money. So it's a lot to do with how we earn money through our careers. There's something about it that's like, it's a higher state of emotion where it's not going into the emotion itself, but it kind of elevated. So it's not to say that Aquarius doesn't deal with emotions, it's just, it already knows what to do with it and go past it. But sometimes when the emotions become too deep, let's say into its, if you look at it from a square perspective, it's squaring the transformative need the need for transformation, or transforming emotions and trauma and all that deeper emotion stuff from Scorpio. Right? It would typically square Scorpio. So Aquarius in this case does have trouble with that. but it needs to look back into its previous incarnations and say, how do I go above the emotions, but at the same time acknowledge it and respect it? And so this is the ideas where this has now become like, that's part of the Aquarian model, or the Aquarian energy, where it doesn't just, in a way, also somewhat transmutes ideas out of emotions, but emotions out of ideas as well, and also experience into ideas, and ideas into experiences as well, because it is ruled by Saturn. So does that make sense? Like Aquarius has that energy. It's a very sort of shifting, it's heavy, but it's also shifting air energy, because it's, it's always changing, right? So Aquarius then has to experience this air energy this air element has to, it goes back into a bit of attachment, but attachment to society this time, or because water is about attachment, but attachment that is not necessarily latching on, unlike Scorpio and Cancer. It has more of a release and saying, here is the emotions, here is the acknowledgement of the emotions. Okay, we've acknowledged it and we have empathy behind it and all that stuff, and we learn, if it's learned compassion, it's learned to collect all that energy, ideas, that airy stuff, into putting into emotion. But because it's so shifty, this is what makes Pisces the water sign known to be aloof and not really in. Now when you're looking at Piscean energy, you're looking at it, this water flow, it flows, so it attaches, but it kind of leaves behind what it needs to leave behind, and then detaches. That's a lesson that Pisces definitely has to learn, right? But Pisces, because of the transition from Aquarius, there's that Saturn thing where it attaches back into sometimes, but it wants to let go, but also detach. Attach, detach, attach, detach, attach, detach, right? It's a sign ruled by not only Neptune, which is the planet of transcendence, so therefore detach, but also the planet of, but also Jupiter, which is the planet of optimism or growth. But it's also with traditions, tied to traditions as well, because even though it's optimizing, it's optimism, it's because it's going forward in some, has a lot of this belief in like free, it's sort of this thing. Jupiter has this sort of, the shadow of Jupiter is to kind of control, and it is the king of the gods, right? Jupiter is like, oh, just like, there's an egoic thing to it as well, and that's also fire. So with Pisces there, the ego is how do you say it? Is hurt. It's kind of like, This is why Pisces, many Pisceans they're very highly intuitive. It's the most intuitive sign of the entire 12 signs of the whole zodiac, because it knows what needs to be kept. It's basically also, it rules the 12th house, which is the house of, it's the dustbin. It's where we kind of put things aside. It's almost like this auto collectiveness, auto collection, auto tradition, everything becomes so automatic. It's a rule. It's this house of the subconscious, or dreams, things that we don't want to deal with, which is also karmic, which is also the shadow as well. So everything is pretty much in this. And Piscean has that. The reason why it is aloof, because it doesn't want to attach itself. It wants to be up there, but at the same time knows that it's what needs to be done here, but it's also out there. So it wants to link the matter with over matter, if that makes sense. I don't know, it's like not antimatter, but yeah, you could probably say antimatter. So it takes on the energies of the heavy air from Aquarius, which is about science and innovations and revolution and all that stuff and change, and use it so that it becomes, instead of the emotion, instead of the thoughts and the ideas, it becomes more about sensing and feeling and intuiting it, and actually, right? So this water is then, doesn't just have these ups and downs. It has like not just roller coaster effect, but side, left, right, up and down, around and about, inside and out sort of feel. This is very turbulent emotions comes through in Pisces. It's very, This is why it's very sensitive as well, because of the turbulence. It goes from so it kind of almost like it subconsciously, this is the 12th house, right? It subconsciously absorbs from outside and brings it back in, and sometimes it does the opposite as well. But most likely it does tend to absorb more. This is why Piscean energy is also about gullibility, high beliefs, idealized beliefs, so much so that it's like out there. It's sort of almost forgotten how to be grounded. And because of that, it has a little bit, this water needs to learn how to work with honoring itself again, and honoring that when you're in the form, in the third dimensional this dimension, you have to honor the horizontal. Then you bring in the vertical when it's called for, when you're ready, when you're intuitive, and when it's ready. You have to trust that it's whole. This is part of the Piscean energy, the Piscean model. Okay, it can't just be out there, it has to back here. But then sometimes it gets lost in the beliefs, it gets lost in the emotion, it gets lost in the trusting, it gets lost in feeling, gets lost even in the thoughts, it gets lost in many ways. Right? This is the house of you can say the lost, and this is why it wants to also, this is also the house of secrets as well. Things you sweep under the rug and keep it secret, because we want to process it. Our inner Pisces wants to elevate, but also stay here. So it's both, it's everything all at once and everywhere. This is why, if you've seen that movie, this is what it ties to. It's a very Piscean energy. And anyways, so once it start to really evolve, and once it's come full circle and really know more about itself, the cycle again renews. The cycle begins again. And when I say begins again, the cycle never really ends, right? What we don't ignore carries over to the next cycle. What we don't acknowledge, what we're not honest about, carries over to the next cycle. So any garbage, any baggage that you have, that's a transition, 12th to the first house transition. And it's like, oh crap, I didn't deal with it. Now you have to go over it again. Now you have to go over it again. Unless we really learn how to deal with it. And this is so Pisceans need to learn how to, this water energy has to learn how to take initiative again. And learns how to, when I say initiative, it means that it needs to figure out what it wants. It needs to figure out how to work with what works and work with what doesn't work. Both for the sake of the collective and back to the individual as well. Because you cannot honor this, you cannot honor the collective without honoring the individual. And that's the 12th to the first house transition. And that's where Pisces goes into Aries again. It needs to release what needs to be released and trust that it's okay to be in this form. It's okay to see it as it is. That's a transition. A lot of energy that came out there. So I hope this was a bit of an insight, because definitely came through me, the insights, lots of it. And I hope this helps give you more understanding of how the elements and the signs work, plus also the qualities of that. Remember that it's not about the labels, it's about just working with it and having fun and just enjoying it. Astrology isn't end all be all. It's a mapping out of what's already there. It's a map. That's why it's called mapping out. It's a tool. So we'll end this with a bit of just being here. Bring your attention to the body. Let the thoughts pass. Whatever you're feeling, surrender to it. Just be here and now. Follow your breath. And any tension that you're going through, surrender to the tension. Keep doing this until you feel more present and not in a hurry, nothing rushed, no tension, just joy, ease, and lightness. Surrender and trust. Surrender to it. Thank you for watching.